Who would have thought the quiet girl from a humble farm could strike terror into the hearts of the toughest bandits? What they didn't know was her legendary reputation as the deadliest gunslinger in the West, until they made the mistake of crossing her. The morning sun rose lazily over the expansive plains, painting the fields in shades of gold and amber. The gentle clucking of chickens and the rhythmic creak of the old water pump gave the impression of another uneventful day on the Carter family farm. But for 22-year-old Emily Carter, this peaceful facade was just a cover for the storm brewing beneath. Emily had always been the picture of an ordinary farm girl, braids tucked under her straw hat, a warm smile for everyone who passed, and calloused hands that spoke of long days spent tending to crops and livestock. To the locals of Redstone Valley, she was simply Em, the shy daughter of the late John Carter, a man whose death had left an undeniable void in the community. What they didn't know, what no one could possibly imagine, was that Emily had a secret life. She wasn't just a farm girl. She was a legend years before Chao. When the notorious Copperhead gang killed her father and burned their fields, Emily disappeared for nearly 5 years. When she returned, there was a shadow in her gaze, a sharpened edge to her posture, and whispers began to follow her. Stories of a lone gunslinger feared across the frontier, whose aim never faltered, and who left a trail of justice and vengeance in her wake. The name of that gunslinger, the Viper. But here in Redstone Valley, she had buried that part of herself. Her days were quiet, her life simple. That is, until a gang of outlaws rolled into town and decided the Carter farm was an easy target. It began with the sound of distant hoofbeats, faint at first but growing louder with every second. Emily, crouched by the barn repairing a broken fence, froze. Her piercing blue eyes narrowed as she scanned the horizon. A cloud of dust trailed the approaching riders, their silhouettes framed against the rising sun. She felt her heart rate quicken, not with fear, but with the familiar rush of anticipation. "Not again," she muttered under her breath, standing tall and brushing the dirt from her hands. She could feel it in her gut. Trouble was coming. The bandits' arrival was as loud and brash as Emily had expected. 5 men rode up to the Carter farm, their horses snorting and pawing at the ground. The leader, a burly man with a scar running from his temple to his chin, tipped his hat as he dismounted. His grin was more of a sneer, and his voice carried the arrogance of someone who had bullied his way through life. "Good morning, miss," he drawled, scanning the modest farmhouse and the barn. "We couldn't help but notice this fine property on our way through. Looks like you've been holding out some supplies, huh?" Emily straightened, and her expression neutral, though her mind raced. She had faced men like this before, arrogant, overconfident, and oblivious to what lay beneath the surface. They were dangerous, but they also underestimated her. That would be their downfall. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said evenly, her voice calm but firm. "This is a small farm. There ain't much here worth taking." Scarface chuckled, his cronies joining in like a chorus of hyenas. "Now don't sell yourself short, darling. My boys and we've got a keen eye for opportunity. Surely you've got some food, maybe some valuables tucked away. We'll just help ourselves, make it quick and painless." Emily's jaw tightened. "You'd best be on your way. This isn't the kind of place you want to linger." One of the younger bandits, a wiry man with an ill-fitting hat, stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Or what? How you gonna sick your chickens on us?" the others roared with laughter. But Emily's gaze remained locked on the leader. Her stillness wasn't submission, it was calculation. "You've got about 30 seconds to turn those horses around and ride out," she said, her voice dropping to a tone that even the bandits couldn't ignore. "Otherwise, things are gonna get ugly." Scarface's grin faltered for just a moment, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Now listen here, girl. You don't get to call the shots. You're outnumbered, outgunned." He never finished his sentence. In one fluid motion, Emily reached behind her, grabbed the shotgun hidden against the barn wall, and cocked it with a deafening click. The sound echoed across the farm, silencing the bandits' laughter. Her steady aim was locked on Scarface, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. "You think being loud makes you powerful," she said, her voice cold. "Try me." The gang froze, exchanging uncertain glances. This wasn't the reaction they'd expected from a farm girl. The leader's bravado flickered, but he still tried to hold his ground. "You won't shoot," he said. though his voice lacked its previous confidence. "You're bluffing." Emily's lips curled into a small, humorless smile. "I don't bluff." Before anyone could react, she shifted her aim slightly and pulled the trigger. The blast rang out, and the bandit closest to Scarface yelped as his hat flew off, the buckshot grazing his scalp. He stumbled back, clutching his head, while the others scrambled to draw their weapons. "Next shot won't miss," Emily warned, her voice steady as stone. "Get off my land." Scarface hesitated, his hand twitching near his holster, but there was something in Emily's eyes, something that made his blood run cold. She wasn't afraid. Worse, she was in control, and he could see she was ready to follow through on her threat. "We'll be back," he snarled, motioning for his men to retreat. "You can count on that. Make sure you bring a bigger crew," Emily shot back, lowering the shotgun slightly but keeping her posture firm. "You'll need it." The bandits mounted their horses in a clumsy hurry, casting nervous glances back at Emily as they rode off. Dust kicked up behind them, fading into the horizon. Emily stood her ground until they were out of sight, the tension in her shoulders only easing once she was certain they were gone. But she knew this wasn't over. Emily returned to the barn, her mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. She couldn't let her guard down. If these bandits came back, and she was certain they would, they'd be more prepared, more ruthless. The peace she'd fought so hard to build here was now in jeopardy. She took a deep breath, running a hand through her hair. Her father's old revolver was still tucked away in the house, along with the rest of her gear from the years she'd spent as the Viper. She had hoped to leave that life behind, to focus on the quiet rhythms of the farm. But it seemed her past wasn't done with her yet. "Guess I'll have to remind them who they're dealing with," she muttered, a flicker of steel in her eyes. The bandits didn't stray far. Emily watched from the porch as their silhouettes lingered on the distant ridge, faint specks against the amber glow of the setting sun. They weren't the type to leave a challenge unanswered. She could feel their anger simmering from miles away, feeding their bruised egos and clouding their judgment. It was only a matter of time before they returned, and when they did, they wouldn't come alone. The evening air was crisp and quiet, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing in Emily's mind. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the farm ground her, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of the wind through the trees, the distant cluck of her hens. This was the life she had chosen after walking away from the chaos of her past, a life of peace, hard work, and simplicity. But the peace she had fought so hard to protect was hanging by a thread. Emily stepped inside the house, her boots echoing softly against the wooden floor. The walls were adorned with simple but meaningful decorations, family photos, hand-stitched quilts, and an old clock that had once belonged to her mother. But her focus was on the heavy wooden chest tucked beneath the staircase. She knelt before it, her fingers hesitating on the latch. The chest hadn't been opened in years, its contents a relic of a life she had sworn to leave behind. But tonight, the farm wasn't just her sanctuary, it was her battlefield. And she couldn't afford to fight this battle unarmed. With a deep breath, Emily opened the chest. The scent of leather and gun oil wafted out, stirring memories she had tried to bury. Inside lay her tools of the trade: a well-worn holster, a pair of finely tuned revolvers, a set of throwing knives, and a wide-brimmed black hat that had once struck fear into anyone who dared cross her path. Beneath them was a bundle of faded wanted posters, her own face staring back at her with the moniker that had followed her for years, the Viper. She picked up one of the revolvers, running her fingers over the smooth steel. The weight in her hand was both familiar and foreign, a reminder of what she was capable of and what it had cost her. For a moment, she wavered, torn between the person she had become and the person she might need to be again. The sound of approaching hooves snapped her out of her thoughts. Emily rose to her feet, slipping the revolver into its holster and strapping it to her hip. She grabbed the black hat and placed it firmly on her head, the brim casting a shadow over her steely gaze. A single rider approached the farmhouse, his silhouette barely visible in the dimming light. Emily stepped onto the porch, her hand resting casually on the revolver at her side. The rider dismounted, keeping his hands visible as he approached. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice smooth but laced with caution. "I don't mean no trouble, just a messenger." Emily narrowed her eyes. A messenger for who? The man hesitated, glancing nervously over his shoulder before stepping closer. Scar wanted me to let you know he's coming back, said you should be ready. Emily's grip tightened on her revolver. Tell him I'm always ready. The messenger's lips twitched into a faint smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'll let him know. But between you and me, ma'am, you might want to think about skipping town. Scar don't take kindly to being embarrassed, and he's bringing a whole lot more than words next time. I'll take my chances, Emily said coldly. Now, unless you've got something else to say, you'd best be on your way. The man nodded, tipping his hat before retreating to his horse. Good luck, ma'am, he said over his shoulder as he mounted up. You'll need it. As the messenger rode off, Emily's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about protecting her farm, it was about sending a message. She had walked away from her past, but the skills and instincts she had honed as the Viper were still a part of her. And if Scar and his gang thought they could intimidate her, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Emily spent the rest of the evening preparing for what was to come. She fortified the farmhouse, setting traps and barricades around the property. She mapped out every possible entry point, ensuring she had the upper hand no matter where the attack came from. In the barn, she saddled her horse, a strong and loyal mare named Willow. She loaded her gear, spare ammunition, knives, and a rifle into the saddlebags, readying herself for the possibility of a chase. By the time the moon rose high in the sky, Emily was ready. She stood on the porch, her black hat casting a shadow over her face, her revolvers gleaming in the moonlight. The night was still, the air thick with anticipation. They wanted a fight, she murmured to herself, her voice steady and calm. Let's give them one. The calm of the night was a fragile thing, teetering on the edge of chaos. Emily stood on her porch, the wide expanse of her land stretching out under the silver glow of the moon. Her eyes scanned the horizon, sharp and unyielding. She could feel it. Trouble wasn't far off. And then she heard it. The faint rumble of horses' hooves, growing louder with each passing second. Emily's heart tightened, but her face remained stoic. She knew this was no ordinary visit. Scar and his gang had arrived. The first sign of them came in the form of a torch, its flickering flame a beacon in the dark. Soon more torches appeared, moving like fireflies across the ridge. The bandits didn't try to conceal their approach. Their confidence was as loud as the laughter and curses that echoed through the night air. There were at least a dozen of them, their silhouettes dark and menacing against the moonlit backdrop. Emily didn't move from her spot on the porch. She stood tall, her revolver resting lightly against her thigh. Let them come, she thought. Let them think they've already won. As the gang drew closer, their voices became clearer. Scar was at the front, his large frame casting a long shadow. He was grinning, his yellowed teeth catching the light of the torches. His men flanked him, their faces twisted with arrogance and malice. Well, well, Scar called out, his voice rough and mocking. Look who's waiting for us. The farm girl who thinks she's tougher than she looks. His men laughed, the sound cruel and taunting. Emily stepped forward, the wooden boards of the porch creaking softly under her boots. You're trespassing, Scar. I'd advise you to turn around and head back the way you came. Scar threw his head back and laughed, a sound that grated on Emily's nerves. Oh, sweetheart, you got this all wrong. We ain't here for your permission. We're here to take what we want. And what exactly is that? Emily asked, her voice calm but cold. Scar's grin widened. Your farm, for starters. A little revenge wouldn't hurt either. My boys don't take kindly to being embarrassed in front of the whole town. The gang whooped and hollered in agreement, their voices dripping with menace. Emily's gaze swept over them, her mind cataloguing every detail, the number of men, the weapons they carried, the positions they were taking. Her years as the Viper had taught her to read a situation in seconds, to anticipate her enemies' moves before they made them. Scar dismounted his horse and began to approach the porch, his boots crunching against the gravel. I'll give you one last chance, farm girl. Hand over the deed to this place and everything on it, and maybe, just maybe, we'll leave you in one piece. Emily's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. You're making a mistake, Scar. Oh, am I? He sneered, stopping a few feet from the porch. And what's a little thing like you gonna do about it? In a flash, Emily drew her revolver and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the ground at Scar's feet, sending a spray of dirt into the air. The gang fell silent, their jeers replaced by shocked murmurs. Emily cocked a revolver, her movements fluid and precise. That was a warning. The next one won't miss. Scar's grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. He hadn't expected this. None of them had. They'd come to the farm expecting an easy victory, a helpless girl they could intimidate into submission. Instead, they were facing a woman who radiated a quiet, deadly confidence. Scar's men shifted nervously in their saddles, their earlier bravado waning. "Boss," one of them muttered. "Maybe we should—" "Shut up," Scar snapped, his eyes never leaving Emily. "She's bluffing. There's no way she can take on all of us." Emily's smile widened, her voice as sharp as the steel in her hand. "Try me." Scar's pride wouldn't let him back down. He raised a hand, signaling his men to move forward. "Teach her a lesson," he growled. The gang dismounted, spreading out as they approached the house. Emily waited until they were within range before making her move. She fired again, this time hitting the torch in one of the men's hands. The flame extinguished, plunging the area into darkness. Panic rippled through the group as Emily disappeared into the shadows. Using the traps she had set earlier, Emily began picking them off one by one. A tripwire sent one man sprawling into the dirt, while another fell victim to a concealed snare that left him dangling from a tree. The chaos spread quickly, and the gang's confidence crumbled with each passing second. Scar shouted orders, trying to regain control, but it was too late. Emily was everywhere and nowhere, her movements swift and silent. The woman they had underestimated was proving to be their worst nightmare. The chaos was deafening. Scar's gang scrambled in the darkness, their earlier bravado replaced by confusion and fear. The once confident men cursed and shouted, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of panic. The farmstead, with its quiet charm and open fields, had transformed into a battlefield, and they were losing. Scar crouched behind a broken fence post, his hand gripping his revolver tightly. His mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They were the predators, not the prey. Yet here they were, being hunted by a farm girl with the skills of a seasoned warrior. "Boss!" one of his men yelled, stumbling into view. His face was pale, and his breathing was ragged. "She's picking us off one by one. We gotta get out of here." Scar snarled, grabbing the man by the front of his shirt. "Shut your mouth. We're not running from some girl. She's just one person." But even as he said the words, doubt crept into his voice. He had seen the precision in her movements, the cold calculation in her eyes. Whoever this woman was, she wasn't just a farmer. She was something far more dangerous. Emily moved through the shadows with practiced ease, her footsteps silent against the ground. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on her face. She was calm, her breathing steady. Every movement was deliberate, every step calculated. From her vantage point near the barn, she could see Scar barking orders at his men. They were scattered and disorganized, their formation broken. Perfect. Her hand brushed against the stock of the Winchester rifle slung over her shoulder. It wasn't her preferred weapon. She liked the intimacy of a revolver, but it would do for now. Taking careful aim, she fired at the lantern held by one of the men, plunging them further into darkness. "Another light down," she muttered to herself, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Let's see how brave they are now." Scar's second in command, a wiry man named Red, crawled up to him, his face streaked with dirt. "Boss, this ain't working. She's got the upper hand. We need to regroup." "Regroup where?" Scar snapped. "She's got us boxed in like cattle. If we move, we're sitting ducks." Red glanced around nervously, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "She's picking us off too fast. Maybe we should—" "Don't even say it," Scar growled. "We're not running." But the cracks in Scar's leadership were beginning to show. His men were losing faith, and it was only a matter of time before someone made a break for it. From her position near the well, Emily called out, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Scar, how's that plan of yours working out? Still think I'm just a farm girl?" Scar's jaw tightened, his hand clenching into a fist. "You think this is funny, girl? You think you can take us all down on your own?" Emily's laugh was soft and mocking, drifting through the darkness. "Who says I'm alone?" The lie hit its mark. Scar's eyes darted around the property, searching for signs of other attackers. His men exchanged uneasy glances, their fear growing. If there were more people working with her, they were hopelessly outnumbered. Red whispered urgently, "Boss, we don't know how many there are. We need to fall back." Scar hesitated, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His pride told him to stay and fight, but the growing panic in his men's eyes was hard to ignore. Emily knew she had them where she wanted them, scared, disoriented, and questioning their decisions. But she also knew the fight wasn't over. Scar was stubborn, and desperate men could be dangerous. She moved quickly to the barn, where she had stashed a few surprises. Inside, the scent of hay and leather filled the air. Her fingers grazed the edge of a wooden crate, pulling out a set of firecrackers. They weren't lethal, but they were loud enough to cause a distraction. Lighting the first fuse, she tossed the firecrackers into the middle of the gang's position. The sharp pops echoed through the night, startling the men and sending them scrambling for cover. Scar cursed loudly, firing his revolver blindly into the darkness. "Come out and fight, you coward," Emily smirked, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "Oh, I'm fighting, Scar. You're just not ready for the way I fight." Scar's frustration boiled over as another of his men cried out, caught in one of Emily's traps. The gang leader turned to Red, his face twisted with anger. "Fine. If she wants a fight, she'll get one. Burn the place down. Let's see how tough she is when her farm's in ashes." Red hesitated, but the look in Scar's eyes brooked no argument. He grabbed a torch from one of the men and began to move toward the barn. But Emily was already there, waiting. As Red approached, the faint click of a revolver stopped him in his tracks. He turned slowly to find Emily standing behind him, her weapon aimed squarely at his chest. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said, her voice icy. Red froze, his eyes wide with fear. He had no doubt she would pull the trigger without hesitation. Scar's command to burn the place down had already been set in motion before Red was intercepted by Emily. Another gang member, eager to prove his loyalty, had ignited a bundle of dry hay near the edge of the barn. Flames licked hungrily at the wood, casting an ominous orange glow against the night sky. Emily's sharp eyes caught the growing fire from her position. Her heart sank, not for her own safety, but for the farm. The barn wasn't just a building, it was a legacy, a place where her family's blood, sweat, and tears had been poured over generations. She couldn't let it be reduced to ashes. "Looks like you've crossed a line you can't uncross, and Scar," Emily shouted, her voice laced with steel. "You think this is going to save you?" Scar sneered from his hiding spot, his features illuminated by the flickering flames. "You can't fight fire with bullets, girl. Let's see you put that out before it takes everything you got." Emily acted quickly. She knew the flames could spread uncontrollably if she didn't act fast. Leaving Red tied up against a post with his hands bound, she sprinted toward the well, grabbing a nearby bucket. Her movements were swift but calculated. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. As she hauled up a heavy load of water, the heat from the growing fire singed her skin. Determined, she splashed the water over the flames nearest the barn's foundation, slowing their advance. The smell of charred wood and smoke filled the air, but she didn't let it distract her. The sound of approaching footsteps made her pause. Turning, she saw another of Scar's men, his figure silhouetted against the blaze. He grinned wickedly, raising his gun. "Not so tough now, are you?" he taunted. Emily didn't hesitate. She ducked behind the well, her hand darting to the revolver holstered at her hip. With a single, precise shot, the man's weapon flew from his hand, clattering to the ground. He stumbled back, clutching his hand in pain, and fled into the night. "Not tonight," she muttered, returning her focus to the fire. Meanwhile, the glow from the fire hadn't gone unnoticed. Over the hill, lights flickered on in neighboring farmhouses. The townspeople, many of whom had known Emily and her family for years, began to gather. Among them was Sheriff Langston, a grizzled but fair man who had always held a soft spot for the orphaned farm girl. When the first call about trouble at Emily's farm reached him, Langston didn't hesitate. Saddling his horse and rallying a group of deputies, he made his way toward the property. The sight that greeted him, a gang of outlaws causing havoc and flames threatening the barn, made his blood boil. "Let's move!" Langston barked, spurring his horse forward. The deputies followed, lanterns swinging in their hands and rifles at the ready. Scar's confidence was unraveling. Between Emily's relentless counterattacks and the arrival of reinforcements, the situation was spiraling out of control. He barked orders to his remaining men, but their morale was shot. The fire, which he had intended as a psychological weapon, now loomed as a dangerous liability. "We need to finish this now," Scar growled, his eyes darting toward the sound of approaching hooves. One of his men, a wiry figure named Jeb, hesitated. "Boss, this ain't looking good. Maybe we cut our losses." Scar's hand lashed out, striking Jeb across the face. "You want to run? Go ahead, but you won't get far." Jeb, humiliated and furious, muttered something under his breath before slinking away into the shadows. Scar didn't notice. His focus was on Emily, who had returned to the cover of the barn. Her face streaked with soot, but her resolve unbroken. The sight of Sheriff Langston and his deputies arriving at the farm brought a surge of hope to Emily. She allowed herself a brief moment to breathe, grateful for the backup. Langston dismounted his horse and approached her, his rifle slung over one shoulder. "Looks like you've had quite the night," he said, his tone grim but respectful. Emily nodded, her voice steady despite the exhaustion creeping in. "It's not over yet. Scar's still out there, and he's not leaving quietly." Langston nodded, his weathered face hardening. "We'll take care of it. You've done more than enough." But Emily wasn't about to step aside. "This is my fight, Sheriff. They came here for me, and I'm going to see it through." Langston studied her for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "All right. Just don't do anything reckless." From his vantage point near the tree line, Scar watched the deputies spread out across the farm. His mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. He couldn't afford to leave empty-handed, not after the humiliation Emily had dealt him. Spotting Emily near the barn, he saw his chance. If he could take her out, he might still salvage some of his reputation. Drawing his revolver, he began to move, his steps silent against the dry grass. But Emily had already anticipated his move. She had been watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. When he stepped into the open, her voice rang out, clear and commanding. "Drop it, Scar. You're done." Scar froze, his gun halfway raised. For the first time that night, true fear flashed across his face. He knew he was beaten, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. "You think you've won, girl," he sneered. "This ain't over." Emily's grip on her revolver didn't waver. "Oh, it's over. And you're gonna answer for every wrong you've done." Scar's words hung heavy in the air, echoing over the crackling fire. Emily stood firm, her revolver aimed squarely at his chest. Her sharp breathing matched the rhythm of her heart, but her hand remained steady. Around her, the farm was a battlefield, a stark contrast to the place of peace and solace it had been her entire life. "You gonna shoot me, girl?" Scar taunted, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "Go ahead. Prove to everyone you're no better than me." Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, and Scar saw it. His sneer widened. "That's what I thought. You ain't got it in you." But Emily wasn't frozen by fear. Her mind raced with the weight of the decision before her. Scar deserved to face justice, but taking a life, even his, felt like crossing a line she couldn't return from. Her father had taught her better. "This isn't about being better than you," Emily replied, her voice low but firm. "It's about doing what's right." Sheriff Langston, sensing the escalating tension, stepped forward. His presence was like a steadying hand on a shaking bridge. "Emily," he called softly, his tone careful but authoritative. "You've done enough. Lower the gun." Her green eyes flicked to Langston, then back to Scar. The sheriff's words echoed her own conscience, but there was an internal war waging within her. Scar had hurt so many people, caused so much pain. Letting him walk away, even in chains, felt like an injustice. Scar, emboldened by her hesitation, took a slow step forward. "Listen to the sheriff a little, girl. Go back to playing farmer. Leave the real work to the men." Emily's jaw tightened. She took a single step toward him, her aim never wavering. "Take one more step, Scar, and I'll show you just how wrong you are." From behind, Langston placed a steady hand on Emily's shoulder. "Listen, kid," he murmured. "You don't want to carry this weight. Trust me. Let the law handle it." Emily's grip on the revolver tightened. She could feel the heat of the fire behind her, the chaos that Scar and his men had unleashed. But Langston's words reached a part of her that she had tried to bury all night, the part that still clung to her values, even in the face of overwhelming violence. Finally, she nodded. Slowly, she lowered her gun, though her gaze never left Scar. "Fine," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "Take him." Langston motioned to two of his deputies, who moved swiftly to apprehend Scar. But as they closed in, Scar's bravado cracked. He lunged for the nearest horse, desperate to escape. The movement was quick, reckless, but Emily was quicker. In a blur, she raised her revolver and fired. The shot wasn't meant to kill, only to stop. Scar cried out in pain as the bullet grazed his leg, sending him sprawling to the ground. His attempt to flee had failed miserably. Langston approached, shaking his head. "You never learn, do you, Scar?" He signaled for the deputies to secure the outlaw. "Get him in cuffs before he tries something else." As they hauled Scar to his feet, Emily turned away, holstering her weapon. The adrenaline that had fueled her all night was beginning to fade, leaving behind a hollow ache in its place. Emily walked to the edge of the field, where the rising sun was beginning to paint the horizon with soft hues of orange and pink. The fire had been extinguished, thanks to the combined efforts of the deputies and the arriving townsfolk. The barn was charred but still standing, a testament to her resilience. Langston joined her, his hat in his hands. "You did good, Emily," he said quietly. "Better than most would have." She shook her head. "I don't feel good, Sheriff. I feel tired. And angry." "That's normal," Langston replied, his voice heavy with experience. "You went through hell tonight, but you didn't let it break you. That counts for something." Emily sighed, her eyes fixed on the distant hills. "He almost got away." "If I hadn't stopped him," Langston interrupted, his tone firm but kind. "You did stop him, and you did it without becoming like him. That's what makes you stronger." The townsfolk began to disperse, their murmured voices carrying a mix of admiration and relief. Several people approached Emily, offering words of gratitude and praise. Sarah, the owner of the general store, clasped Emily's hands tightly. "You saved this town, Emily," Sarah said, tears welling in her eyes. "We owe you everything." Emily offered a faint smile but remained quiet. She didn't feel like a hero, just someone who had done what needed to be done. As the last of the crowd left, Emily returned to the barn. Inside, she found Red still tied up, his head bowed in defeat. She untied him, her movements brisk but not unkind. "Why didn't you run?" she asked, genuinely curious. Red shrugged, his voice hoarse. "What's the point? You'd have caught me anyway." Emily regarded him for a moment. "You've got a choice now, Red. Leave this life behind or end up like Scar." He met her gaze, something unreadable in his expression. "Guess I'll think about it." As the dust settled over the farm, Emily sat on the front steps of the house, her rifle leaning against the railing. The adrenaline had drained from her body, replaced by a heavy exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. Sheriff Langston approached, his hat in hand, a look of concern on his weathered face. "You handled yourself well tonight," he began, his voice measured. "But I've been in this game long enough to know when one storm is just the beginning." Emily glanced up at him, her green eyes tired but sharp. "What do you mean?" Langston sighed, lowering himself to sit beside her. "Scar and his gang were bold, sure, but their actions were reckless. That's not how they usually operate. Someone's pushing them, Emily, someone bigger." Before Emily could respond, the sound of hooves broke through the early morning stillness. A lone rider emerged from the trail leading to the farm, a dust-covered figure slouched in the saddle. The deputies, still on site, raised their weapons, but Langston waved them down. The rider dismounted clumsily, stumbling toward them. As he neared, Emily recognized him as Amos, the owner of a ranch on the outskirts of town. His face was pale, his clothes torn, and blood seeped from a wound on his arm. "They came for us," Amos croaked, collapsing onto his knees. "Scar's crew was just the start. There's more of them, dozens riding under someone new. They're calling him the Viper." Langston crouched beside Amos, his expression grim. "The Viper," he repeated, the name unfamiliar but menacing. "You're sure?" Amos nodded weakly. "They hit us just before dawn. Burned the barn, took the horses, said they'd be back for the rest." Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine. The Viper. The name alone carried a sense of malice, conjuring images of a predator lurking in the shadows, ready to strike. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her gut. Langston helped Amos to his feet, signaling for a deputy to tend to his wounds. "I've heard rumors," the sheriff admitted, his voice low. "The Viper's a ghost, a shadow that moves from town to town, leaving chaos in his wake. They say he's a former lawman turned outlaw, ruthless and cunning. Scar and his men might have been running under his orders." Emily clenched her fists. If that's true, he'll come here next. Langston nodded. That's a safe bet. The air around the farm shifted as word spread among the deputies and lingering townsfolk. Fear rippled through them. But Emily felt a different emotion rising within her. Determination. She'd already faced one gang and survived. She wasn't about to let another group tear apart her home. "What's the plan, Sheriff?" Emily asked, standing tall despite her exhaustion. Langston rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "We need to fortify the town, get everyone prepared. If the Viper's coming, we won't be caught off guard." "And what about me?" Emily pressed. The sheriff gave her a hard look. "You've done more than your share tonight. Rest. Let us handle this." Emily shook her head. "You know I can't do that. This is my home, my fight." As the sun climbed higher into the sky, a deputy came rushing toward the house, his face pale. "Sheriff, we found something out by the trail." Langston and Emily followed the deputy to the edge of the farm, where a wooden post had been driven into the ground. Hanging from it was a rattlesnake skin, its fangs bared and its tail tied in a knot. Beneath it, a piece of parchment flapped in the breeze, held in place by a dagger stabbed into the wood. Langston pulled the paper free, reading aloud the crude message scrawled in black ink. "This is only the beginning. The Viper always strikes twice." The message was clear. The Viper's gang was coming, and they wanted the town to know it. Langston wasted no time, gathering his deputies and the remaining townsfolk at the center of Milestone Hollow. "We've got a choice," he told them, his voice ringing out over the gathered crowd. "We can run or we can stand. But if we stand, we do it together." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many looked to Emily, their faith in her bolstered by her actions the night before. Her reputation as the feared gunslinger was spreading, but she still felt like the farm girl her father had raised. "If we're going to fight, we need a plan," Emily said, stepping forward. "Barricades, weapons, supplies, and we need to act fast." As the day wore on, Milestone Hollow came alive with activity. Men and women worked side by side to fortify the town, setting up makeshift barriers and stockpiling ammunition. Emily found herself at the center of the effort, her sharp mind and steady leadership earning the respect of even the most skeptical townsfolk. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were preparing for a storm far larger than they could imagine. As night settled over Milestone Hollow, the glow of lanterns illuminated the hastily constructed barricades and armed townsfolk standing watch. Emily sat on the porch of the saloon, her rifle resting against her knee. She had spent the day directing efforts and rallying spirits, but now, in the quiet moments before the storm, the weight of it all pressed down on her. Sheriff Langston approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. He held 2 steaming mugs of coffee, offering one to Emily. "You've done good work, Emily. Folks around here needed someone to believe in." Emily took the mug with a nod, her fingers brushing against his. "They believe in survival, Sheriff, not me." Langston sat beside her, his gaze scanning the dark horizon. "You're wrong about that. They see what I see, a fighter, someone who doesn't back down, no matter the odds." Emily sipped her coffee, letting the warmth seep into her hands. "I never asked to be that person." Langston chuckled softly. "No one ever does. But sometimes, life doesn't give us a choice." Inside the saloon, a group of townsfolk huddled around a table, laying out a map of the town and discussing strategies. Amos, his arm now bandaged, pointed to the main road leading into Milestone Hollow. "If they're coming, they'll take this route. It's the fastest way in." Red, the former bandit Emily had spared, leaned against the bar, his expression guarded. "They won't come straight in. The Viper's smarter than that. He'll send scouts first, maybe flank from the east." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Red. The man shifted uncomfortably under their scrutiny. "What? I ran with these kinds of people long enough to know how they think." Sarah, the store owner, crossed her arms. "Why should we trust you? You're one of them." Emily entered the saloon, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Because I trust him," she said firmly, meeting Red's eyes. "And right now, we need all the help we can get." Red straightened, surprised by her words. "You're putting a lot of faith in someone who doesn't deserve it." Emily shrugged. "Maybe, but everyone deserves a second chance." Langston, who had followed her inside, added, "If Red says they'll flank, we need to be ready for it. Let's position some sharpshooters on the east ridge." The room buzzed with activity as the townsfolk began assigning roles and tasks. Red lingered near the bar, watching Emily with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Finally, he approached her. "Why'd you vouch for me?" he asked quietly. Emily's gaze didn't waver. "Because you stayed when you could have run. That tells me there's more to you than just a thief." Red looked down, his jaw tightening. "I'm no hero, Emily." She smiled faintly. "Neither am I." As the hours dragged on, Emily found herself drawn into conversations with various townsfolk. Each person had their own fears and hopes, their own reasons for standing their ground. The connections she formed felt like threads weaving together a fragile but resilient tapestry. At one point, she joined Sarah and her teenage son, Jack, who was cleaning an old shotgun. Jack looked up at her with wide eyes. "Is it true you took down Scar's whole gang by yourself?" Emily chuckled, shaking her head. "I had help." Sarah placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "She's being modest, Jack. She saved this town." Jack beamed, his admiration for Emily clear. The moment reminded her of her father, of the pride he had in her resilience. It was a bittersweet memory, but it fueled her determination. As midnight approached, the town grew eerily quiet. The wind carried the faint rustle of leaves, and the stars above shone brightly in the clear sky. Emily patrolled the perimeter with Red, their boots crunching softly on the dirt path. "You think they'll come tonight?" Red asked, his voice low. Emily scanned the darkness, her rifle at the ready. "I don't know, but we'll be ready." Red hesitated before speaking again. "If this goes south, I just want to say thanks for giving me a chance." Emily glanced at him, her expression softening. "We're not done yet, Red. Don't start saying goodbyes." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. The faint sound of a horse's hooves echoed in the distance, breaking the stillness. Emily and Red froze, their eyes snapping to the horizon. A single rider emerged, a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. The figure stopped just beyond the range of their barricades, holding a torch that cast flickering shadows. The rider raised a hand, waving the torch in a slow, deliberate arc. It was a signal, one that sent a chill down Emily's spine. "What does it mean?" Red asked, his voice tight. Emily's grip on her rifle tightened. "It means they're here." The torch-wielding rider remained stationary for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. For a heartbeat, the town was silent, save for the faint rustling of the wind. Emily exchanged a tense glance with Red. "They're testing us," she muttered, "seeing if we'll flinch." Red nodded, his jaw tight. "They won't wait long. Viper's not one for patience." As if to confirm his words, the faint sound of hooves grew louder, multiplied, until the unmistakable rumble of a group of riders filled the air. The gang was approaching, their silhouettes emerging on the ridgeline under the pale moonlight. Emily sprinted back to the barricades, her voice sharp but calm. "Positions, everyone, stick to the plan." The townsfolk scrambled into place, rifles and shotguns aimed at the approaching figures. Sheriff Langston joined her at the front line, his revolver gleaming in the moonlight. "They're coming straight for us," he said grimly. No subtlety this time. Emily's eyes narrowed. "They're confident. Let's remind them why they shouldn't be." The riders broke into a gallop, their shouts echoing across the open field. The ground trembled under the weight of their approach. At the lead was Viper, his long coat billowing behind him, a cruel grin visible even from a distance. He raised a rifle, firing a shot that shattered the eerie stillness. "Hold your fire," Emily shouted, her voice carrying over the chaos. "Wait for my signal." The riders closed in, their figures growing sharper in the lantern light. Emily stood firm, her rifle raised, her breathing steady. When they were within range, she yelled, "Now!" The air erupted with the deafening crack of gunfire. The townsfolk fired in unison, their shots precise and deliberate. The first line of riders faltered, two falling from their saddles as their horses veered off course. Viper barked orders, rallying his men to push forward. The gang split into two groups, one charging the barricades head-on, the other circling to the east as Red had predicted. Emily cursed under her breath, signaling to the sharpshooters on the ridge, "Cover the flank, don't let them through." Langston and Amos held the main barricade, exchanging fire with the bandits. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Wooden crates splintered as bullets tore through them, and the townsfolk ducked behind cover. reloading as quickly as their trembling hands allowed. Sarah and her son Jack crouched near the saloon, Jack clutching his shotgun tightly. "Stay low," Sarah urged, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Amid the chaos, Emily spotted Viper dismounting, using his horse as cover while he barked commands, her green eyes locked onto him, her expression hardening. Without hesitation, she vaulted over the barricade, landing in the open field. The townsfolk gasped as she sprinted toward the enemy, her rifle blazing. "Emily, no!" Langston shouted, but she was already too far ahead. Her sudden charge caught the gang off guard. She took down 2 bandits with precise shots before diving behind a fallen log. Viper's men scrambled to regroup, their attention divided between the barricades and the lone figure wreaking havoc in their midst. On the eastern ridge, Red led a small group of sharpshooters, their shots picking off the bandits attempting to flank the town. He fired with calculated precision, his earlier bravado replaced by a quiet determination. "Hold the line!" he yelled. "Don't let them get through." Despite their best efforts, a few bandits managed to slip past, heading straight for the saloon. Inside, Sarah and Jack braced themselves as the door burst open. Jack fired a wild shot, the recoil nearly knocking him over. The bandit stumbled, clutching his side, but another was already advancing. Before he could fire, a shot rang out, and the bandit collapsed. Red appeared in the doorway, his smoking rifle aimed squarely at the fallen man. "You okay?" he asked, glancing at Sarah and Jack. Sarah nodded, her relief evident. "Thanks to you." Back in the field, Emily was pinned down, her rifle empty. She drew her revolver, firing at the advancing bandits, but they were closing in fast. Viper approached with deliberate steps, his grin widening as he raised his weapon. "You've got guts, girl," he sneered, "but this is where it ends." Emily's grip tightened on her revolver, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Not today." Before Viper could pull the trigger, a shot rang out, striking the weapon from his hand. Sheriff Langston stood at the barricade, his revolver aimed with unwavering precision. "Step away from her, Viper," he growled. Viper hesitated, his confidence faltering. Emily seized the moment, lunging forward and knocking him to the ground. They grappled in the dirt, their movements swift and brutal. Emily's training and raw determination gave her the edge. With a final, powerful blow, she disarmed him, pinning him to the ground. The remaining bandits, seeing their leader defeated, faltered. Some dropped their weapons, raising their hands in surrender, while others fled into the night. The gunfire ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Emily stood, her chest heaving, as she looked down at Viper. "It's over," she said, her voice cold. He glared up at her, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You think you've won?" She didn't respond, her expression unreadable as she turned away. Langston approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Emily," she nodded, but her gaze remained distant. The battle was won, but the scars it left would take time to heal. The aftermath of the battle left the town in stunned silence, the acrid scent of gunpowder lingering in the air. Bodies of the defeated bandits lay scattered in the field, while the remaining gang members who had surrendered knelt in a line near the barricades, their hands tied with rough rope. The townsfolk, battered but victorious, began emerging from their cover, their expressions a mixture of relief and disbelief. Emily stood near the center of the battlefield, her revolver still in hand. Viper, bruised and bleeding, knelt before her, his defiance reduced to a flickering ember. Sheriff Langston stood by her side, his revolver trained on the gang leader to ensure there were no last-minute surprises. "You've lost, Viper," Emily said, her voice low but firm. "Your gang is done, and this town is taking its life back." Viper chuckled bitterly, his eyes narrowing. "You think this changes anything? I'm just one man. There'll be others." Emily's jaw tightened, her grip on the revolver unwavering. "Maybe. But they'll know what happens when you push people too far. They'll know this town isn't afraid anymore." The crowd began to gather around Emily and Viper. Red, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, joined them, leaning heavily on his rifle. He gave Emily a faint nod, signaling his approval. Sarah and her son Jack stood near the saloon, their expressions reflecting a newfound respect for the young gunslinger who had defended their home. Langston broke the tense silence. "What do we do with him, Emily?" her green eyes locked onto Viper's, unyielding. "He'll answer for what he's done, all of it," Viper sneered, but his bravado rang hollow. "You think the law scares me? I've got connections. People in high places who'll get me out before you can blink." Emily stepped closer, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Maybe, but they won't stop me from hunting you down if you ever come back. You've seen what I can do. Do you really want to test me?" For the first time, fear flickered across Viper's face. He looked away, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. Sheriff Langston gestured for 2 townsfolk to help him escort the prisoners to the jailhouse. "We'll hold them here until the marshals arrive. Let the law handle the rest." The townsfolk murmured their agreement, though a few cast uneasy glances at the kneeling bandits. Emily could sense their unspoken doubts, their fear that the gang's influence might extend beyond the boundaries of their town. She turned to address them, her voice clear and resolute. "This isn't just about justice," she said. "It's about sending a message to anyone who thinks they can walk into our town and take what they want. We stood together tonight, and we won. That's what they'll remember." The crowd began to relax, the weight of their shared victory settling in. Red clapped a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You've got away with words, farm girl. You sure you're not gunning for my job?" Emily allowed herself a small smile, though her gaze remained distant. "I think I've had my fill of fighting for one night." As the prisoners were led away, Viper threw one last glance over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Something about his composure didn't sit right with her. She caught up to Langston as he secured the jailhouse door. "Keep an extra watch on him," she said quietly. "He's up to something, I can feel it." Langston nodded, his expression grim. "I'll double the guard. Don't worry." But worry she did. As the night deepened and the adrenaline of battle began to fade, Emily found herself pacing the edge of town, her thoughts racing. Victory had come at a cost, lives lost, homes damaged, and trust shaken. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. By dawn, the town began to stir. The people of Prairie Hollow emerged from their homes, surveying the damage and beginning the work of rebuilding. Emily watched from a distance, leaning against a fence post with her hat pulled low. She had done what she set out to do. Defended the town, driven off the gang, and restored a sense of safety. But she knew her journey was far from over. Red approached, his usual smirk replaced by a thoughtful expression. "So you're planning on sticking around?" Emily shrugged, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "For a while, there's still work to be done." Red nodded. "You know, for someone who claimed she just wanted a quiet life, you sure know how to shake things up." A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Guess it's in my blood." As the sun climbed higher, Emily's sense of unease lingered. Viper's words haunted her, the promise of more trouble to come. She couldn't shake the feeling that his connections might still pose a threat, not just to her, but to the town she had come to see as home. She made her way to the jailhouse, where Langston and a handful of deputies stood guard. "Any trouble?" she asked. Langston shook his head. Quiet as can be, almost too quiet. Emily's instincts told her the same. "Stay alert," she warned. "Something tells me this isn't over." Langston gave her a reassuring nod, but Emily's hand remained on the grip of her revolver as she turned to leave. The battle might have been won, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. The dawn brought a fragile sense of relief to Prairie Hollow. Townsfolk swept debris from the streets, patched broken windows, and shared whispered conversations about the previous night. Emily watched from the saloon porch, her arms crossed and her revolver holstered, but never far from reach. Her instincts kept her on edge, a quiet voice in her mind warning that the danger wasn't truly over. Her suspicions were confirmed when Sheriff Langston rushed toward her, his face pale. "Emily," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Viper's gone." "What?" Emily's voice was sharp, her posture instantly rigid. "How?" Langston hesitated, guilt flickering across his face. "One of the deputies. He must have been working with them. Left the cell unlocked and disappeared. Viper and a few of his men are gone." Emily's heart sank, but she didn't allow fear to show. "How long ago?" "Not more than an hour," Langston replied. "We've got men searching, but they'll come back," Emily interrupted, her voice resolute. "Viper won't let this go. Not after what happened last night." As the town prepared for another confrontation, Emily worked quickly, organizing defenses and ensuring that every able-bodied resident was armed and ready. She studied the landscape surrounding Prairie Hollow, her sharp mind formulating a plan. If Viper was returning, she intended to make it his last mistake. She gathered the townsfolk in the saloon, her voice calm but commanding. "We've already shown we can fight," she began. "Now we're going to finish this. Viper and his men are angry, desperate, and dangerous. They'll come back to prove a point, but we're ready for them." Red stepped forward, his rifle slung over one shoulder. "What's the plan, Emily?" "We don't wait for them to hit us," she replied, her green eyes gleaming with determination. "We draw them in and take the fight to them." She outlined her strategy, positioning sharpshooters along key vantage points and setting traps at the town's entrances. The townsfolk listened intently, their earlier fear replaced by a steely resolve. Emily's confidence was infectious, and her plan left no room for doubt. The sound of hooves and wagons approaching shattered the morning stillness. Viper and his men rode into view, their faces twisted with anger and determination. The bandit leader sat tall in the saddle, his snake tattoo catching the sunlight like a sinister promise. Behind him, his gang numbered fewer than the previous night, but still posed a significant threat. Emily stood in the center of the main street, her revolver holstered but her hand resting lightly on the grip. She was a lone figure against the backdrop of the town, but hidden eyes watched from every rooftop and alley. The stage was set. Viper pulled his horse to a halt, glaring at her. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," he growled. "Big mistake." Emily's voice was steady, almost cold. "You had your chance to walk away, Viper. You didn't take it. That's your mistake." With a roar, Viper raised his hand, signaling his men to attack. Chaos erupted as gunfire filled the air, echoing through the narrow streets. The townsfolk held their ground, firing from concealed positions. Emily darted into action, her revolver a blur as she fired with precision, each shot finding its mark. The fight was brutal, but Emily's plan gave the townsfolk a distinct advantage. Traps sprung at key moments, horses reared and threw their riders, and the bandits' numbers dwindled rapidly. Red and Sarah fought side by side, their determination shining through every shot fired. Even Jack, trembling but resolute, held his ground and defended his mother with surprising courage. Emily's focus remained on Viper, her every move calculated to bring the fight to its inevitable conclusion. As the bandits faltered, she advanced, her gaze locked on the man who had caused so much pain and fear. Viper dismounted, drawing his pistol and firing wildly. Emily dodged with ease, her movements swift and deliberate. She closed the distance between them, her revolver steady as she leveled it at him. "End of the line, Viper," she said, her voice low but firm. Viper hesitated, his eyes darting around for an escape. But the sight of his fallen men and the armed townsfolk surrounding him left no doubt. He was beaten. Viper dropped his pistol, the weapon clattering to the ground. "You win," he muttered, his voice heavy with defeat. Emily stepped closer, her revolver still trained on him. "It's not about winning," she replied. "It's about protecting what's ours." Sheriff Langston emerged from the crowd, his rifle aimed squarely at Viper. "We'll take it from here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Two deputies stepped forward, binding Viper's hands and leading him away. As the last of the bandits were rounded up, the townsfolk erupted into cheers. The fight was over, and Prairie Hollow had won. Emily allowed herself a moment to breathe, the weight of victory settling over her. The following morning, the town gathered to celebrate their triumph. The saloon was filled with laughter and music, a stark contrast to the tension and fear of days past. Emily stood on the outskirts, watching the people she had come to care for as they began to rebuild not just their homes, but their lives. Red approached, a grin on his face. "You know, farm girl, you could stick around. Make this your home." Emily smiled faintly, her gaze distant. "Maybe, but there's still a lot of trouble out there, and I'm not one to sit still." Red chuckled. "Well, wherever you go, they'll be lucky to have you." As the sun set over Prairie Hollow, Emily mounted her horse, her revolver resting at her side. She cast one last look at the town she had fought to protect, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Then, without a word, she rode off toward the horizon, ready for whatever came next. The dust may have settled in Prairie Hollow, but Emily's story is far from over. Her courage and determination remind us all of the strength that lies in standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. As she rides off into the horizon, one can only wonder, what new challenges await her? What other towns might need her fearless spirit to restore hope and justice? If this story moved you, imagine the countless untold tales of bravery, resilience, and the power of one person to change everything. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next gripping adventure. And before you go, we've handpicked another story just for you, full of heart, action, and unforgettable characters. Click on the video right here and dive into another thrilling journey. Your next adventure is just a click away.